In the early days of the film archive, we were often asked if there was any old film of Lincolnshire. The answer most definitely was, and is, yes. In the space of 5 years, we've already located and rescued over 200 films showing life and work in the historic county. And rescued is the right word. Film deteriorates badly if it isn't looked after properly, and a good many of the items were in poor condition, lying around in attics and garden sheds. One was even found on a town rubbish dump. Extensive restoration work is often required before damaged films like this can be shown again. But it's worth it, because nothing brings the past back to life quite so vividly as a moving picture. And when the old forgotten reels are once more in running order, Lincolnshire life in the first half of the 20th century is magically recreated for us, preserved on film. Early film tended to be of processions, like this one at Boston in 1910 to mark the proclamation of King George V. In those days, film cameras were heavy and difficult to move, so processions were the ideal subjects. They could easily be filmed from one fixed position. The camera stayed still and the people did the moving. And the more people there were, the better. Events like this St. George's Day parade were generally filmed by the owners of local cinemas. Crowds were good for business. The more local faces you could put on the screen, the more tickets you could sell. Another good bet was a football match. Plenty of people, plenty of action. This one was at Grantham in 1913. It was a special charity match between the fire brigade and the police. Kick-off by the mayor, who looks like an early version of Groucho Marx. And just look what the players are wearing. Distinguished visitors were another popular film subject, and Lincolnshire has had its fair share. King George V and Queen Mary visited Lincoln in 1918. And here's Joseph Kennedy, the American ambassador and father of the later president. In 1937, he came to Boston to celebrate Thanksgiving Day and opened the American Room at Fidel House. Wimbledon tennis star Bunny Austin came to Louth in 1939. And the comedian Tom Walls was a frequent visitor to the area, especially during the shooting season. Game, that is, not film. And if you happened to be at Skegness in 1938, you'll certainly remember the day when Gracie Fields came to Butlins and was driven round wearing a variety of hats. Of course, Lincolnshire has produced some top names of its own, like Alex Henshaw, the pioneer aviator from Mablethorpe, just back from his record-breaking flight to South Africa in 1939. And although you may not recognise Alderman Roberts, Mayor of Grantham just after the Second World War, you'd certainly recognise his daughter Margaret, late of 10 Downing Street. Who knows, somewhere amongst this crowd of Grantham schoolchildren in 1937, you might even be able to spot her. But most of the really interesting old film isn't about people in the public eye. It's about the day-to-day life and work of Lincolnshire people themselves. This is our county, and these were its people. They beat us to it by a couple of generations, but they made the world we live in, and their daily lives are part of our heritage. This is 1913, and these were the employees at Ruston and Hornsby's factory in Grantham, where, a few years earlier, the world's first Caterpillar track vehicles had been developed, ancestors of the tank and a whole host of tractors and earth-moving machinery. It's easy to forget that in the 1920s and 30s, a good many jobs that we think of as totally mechanised were still being done very largely by hand. At Anderby in 1934, there was still a traditional brickworks, where the clay coming out of the pug mill was cut up by hand with a sort of huge cheese wire. At Louth, around the same time, ropes were still being spun by hand in pretty much the same way as they were in the Middle Ages. These were the days when you got your chairs mended or your scissors and knives sharpened by craftsmen who went from house to house and did their work in the street. There were factories too, of course, and Lincolnshire has long had its share of light industry. Here's some informal footage taken at Fisher Clark, the Boston printers and manufacturing stationers, just after the Second World War. But most people tend to associate Lincolnshire with farming and horticulture. Then, of course, there's the bulb industry, which has been thriving for more than half a century. Back in 1935, the cut flowers were still bunched in dozens and tied with raffia. Packing the flowers for market was a time-consuming business. No parcel tying machines in those days. The bulb industry may be a comparative newcomer, but Lincolnshire farmers have been growing potatoes for generations. Traditional methods were slow to disappear, but by 1948, modern technology was starting to revolutionize the whole process. For the first time, aerial crop spraying was a practical possibility, though the size of the aircraft needed made it pretty expensive. The harvesting always used to be done by gangs of Irish potato pickers who did the work by hand. But during the late 1940s, mechanical potato harvesters started to make an appearance in the fields of Lincolnshire. Not surprisingly, agricultural shows featured a good deal on film. Here's the Lincolnshire show at Grantham in the early 1920s. Unfortunately, life doesn't always go quite according to plan. The big freeze-up of 1938 meant reverting to some pretty old-fashioned methods of getting water. There were transport problems too. But somehow or other, people seem to have managed. The youngsters probably rather enjoyed it. But the East Coast floods of 1953 were no fun at all. There was extensive damage to buildings and also to the sea walls, as a film of repairs in progress makes clear. The sea defences were quickly rebuilt using huge quantities of industrial slag, which proved ideal. More than can be said for the film's title, which seems a little unfortunate nowadays. Carnivals and fairs have always provided a ready-made subject for photographers. But luckily, fairs weren't the only type of recreation to be recorded on film. This is Empire Day in Central Park, Boston, in 1922. Four years later, an outing down below into the Wash seems to have led to a rerun. One way and another, it must have been quite a day. No end of football matches have been filmed, of course. Just look at those shorts, 1935 style. If you wanted a leg show, one of the numerous health and beauty displays was the obvious answer. But if that strikes you as a bit too tame, how's this for excitement? Yes, it's Cadwell in 1936. School sports days have always been a popular film subject, but in 1938 it seems you got a different class of competitor. And clearly no one had yet heard of Adidas. Twice this century, the outbreak of war has enabled local filmmakers to cover the home front. Recruiting Day at Grantham in 1915. And King George V, presenting medals at the 4th Northern Hospital at Lincoln in 1918. After the armistice, there seems at first to be little future for aviation. But by the 1930s, it was a different story, although in those days you could still quite happily land and take off on a strip of coastal sand, like this one near Donna Nook. By the later 1930s, people were getting to be very definitely air-minded. Air displays were proving enormously popular. This one was at Grantham in 1937. The renewed outbreak of war a couple of years later brought all sorts of changes to civilian life. Although it was business as usual at the cinema, in spite of the sandbags. Because of the blackout, headlights and sidelights had to be dimmed, although the precise method was up to the individual. Car wings and running boards had to be painted white. With petrol rationing about to be introduced, tanks were filled to overflowing, and people got up to all sorts of tricks to stockpile vital supplies. Buildings soon vanished behind piles of sandbags. And air raid shelters, both public and private, were hastily built in all sorts of places. Meanwhile, the local menfolk were getting ready to march away. The welfare of men and women who now found themselves in uniform was the special concern of organisations like TOC-H, whose dedicated bands of helpers worked tirelessly to provide recreational centres for the forces. One spoonful of sugar was the rule, but it's wonderful what can be done with a charming smile and a spot of nerve. Supplies of film were hard to come by in wartime. Nevertheless, the Louth Home Guard made it as far as the silver screen. You can almost recognize some of the characters, but this isn't a Dad's Army program. This was the real thing. The Boston Home Guard also featured on film, and some of their exploits were even recorded in colour, something we take for granted nowadays, but still quite a novelty in 1942. Civil defence was also vitally important. Gas attacks were expected, and decontamination procedures had to be practiced, although at the Louth cattle market they must have been hoping it'd be all right on the night. Isn't the water supposed to come out at the end? Everyone, young or old, needed to know how to cope with incendiary bombs. In the early days of the war, public demonstrations were organised in many towns. This one was in Louth Marketplace. If things got really out of hand, the auxiliary fire service were ready to come to the rescue. But for some reason, the occupants of the town hall weren't all that keen on being rescued and sent in substitutes. Looking back, it all seems rather amusing, but there's plenty of other material to redress the balance. In happier times, the holiday season has always attracted filmmakers. From the mid-1920s, the availability of small portable movie cameras meant that people could record their own holiday on film, even if their results often lacked the professional touch. Holiday camps of various kinds were becoming popular, though at Trussville in 1932, things still seemed a bit primitive. But just along the coast at Skegness, Butlins was well established by the end of the 1930s, and the beauty contest was a regular feature. What does he think he's doing? There's nothing like hats and vehicles for making a once familiar scene look old-fashioned. Was Lincoln really like this in 1930? And is that what the women were wearing? It's odd to realise that in 1935, Grantham people thought this was traffic congestion. And did we really ride around in buses that looked like this? Or ambulances that looked like this? On the other hand, there are certain things that hardly seem to have changed at all, like getting held up at level crossings. Mind you, it may be a while since you saw a snowplow that looked like this. And 1939 brought a topical new angle to the traditional snowman. But kids plus snow leads to much the same result in any age. Sometimes it's hard to remember that this is archive footage. We're looking back across more than half a century, and it seems like yesterday. So you see, there is old film of Lincolnshire, although there hasn't been time to show you more than a few brief extracts. If you'd like to know more about these and other films in the archive, or if you know of some old film that you think might be of interest to us, do please get in touch. In the meantime, our thanks to all the filmmakers, known and unknown, whose hard work and enterprise in times gone by have enabled so much of Lincolnshire's past to live on into the present and to be preserved for future generations.